archived in secret, far away from public eyes.
For months, Meghan Markle had chosen a silence so absolute, so unwavering, that it became a kind of living statement, a stillness in the storm, a deliberate retreat from a world that demanded her every word, every emotion, every carefully calculated smile and measured gesture. A silence that many outside her inner circle had interpreted as coldness, as detachment, as a willful indifference to the relentless scrutiny of tabloid headlines, social media speculation, and the endless, prying gaze of a global public whose fascination with the British royal family often veered into obsession. Yet in reality, this silence was not emptiness but a carefully orchestrated pause, a defensive shield constructed out of necessity and love, a protection not for herself but for her daughter, Lilibet, whose well-being had become, in Meghan's eyes, a matter far more urgent and delicate than the preservation of image, the performance of etiquette, or the appeasement of centuries-old institutional expectations. And it was this very silence, this deliberate withholding, that had become a statement in itself, a quiet yet ferocious declaration that she would not allow her child to be swept up in the machinery of control that had ensnared so many before her, a machinery that had, in its relentless pursuit of perfection and adherence to protocol, shown time and again that it cared far more about perception than truth, far more about optics than the fragile, beating hearts behind the palace walls. And then, after months of what the world perceived as passive withdrawal, that silence shattered with a suddenness that left journalists, aides, commentators, and casual observers alike scrambling for context, scrambling to understand the words that emerged not from a polished press office nor from the hands of a carefully briefed communications team, but directly from Meghan's own office in Montecito, unfiltered, raw, urgent, and carrying a weight so devastating that it reverberated instantly across the globe. The statement, brief yet monumental in implication: "My daughter is hurting. This cannot go on," a sentence that in its simplicity conveyed more than any press release, more than any carefully worded royal communique could ever capture, because it was at once personal and universal, a mother's cry laid bare, a royal confession that pierced the veneer of invulnerability, and a chilling signal that something deeply serious, profoundly unsettling, and heartbreakingly intimate was occurring behind the walls that had long protected, restrained, and controlled the family's narrative. And as the words leaped into public consciousness, the world reacted not with polite curiosity but with a wildfire of speculation, the rapid spread of social media chatter, the intense focus of international news organizations, all converging on Lilibet, a child who had been meticulously shielded from such attention, now thrust unwillingly into a spotlight that illuminated not her achievements, her milestones, or her playful moments, but the very real pain that her mother had chosen to expose, to acknowledge publicly when the private corridors of power had failed to respond. And the implications of that exposure were enormous, because it revealed cracks in the palace's carefully maintained facade, a lack of preparedness and coordination among those whose professional lives revolved around controlling information, and it raised uncomfortable questions about what had been hidden, suppressed, or ignored. Questions that insiders had whispered about in hushed tones long before the statement, questions that suggested a history of interference, mismanagement, and perhaps even neglect, all carefully obscured under layers of tradition, hierarchy, and the unspoken rules that govern the monarchy's inner workings. And yet, despite the gravity of her words, despite the immediate public attention and viral nature of the statement, there was no immediate, coordinated response from the palace, no joint message, no carefully phrased reassurance, only a disoriented staff caught mid-meeting, blindsided, scrambling to understand the meaning, the timing, the unprecedented unilateral disclosure. And this chaos, this absence of control, only magnified the sense of urgency, the perception that Meghan had reached a point of breaking, that her decision to speak out was not impulsive but born of months of observation, vigilance, and a deepening concern that the systems supposedly in place to protect her child were failing, and that inaction was no longer an option. And as the story spread, it became evident that the heart of the matter was not merely a fleeting discomfort or a temporary setback but a serious, ongoing crisis that had roots extending back months, perhaps years, into patterns of oversight, concealment, and tension that had long simmered quietly within the palace, invisible to the public eye but glaringly obvious to those who observed the subtleties of staff movements, abrupt changes in caretakers, sudden withdrawals from previously arranged engagements, all of which pointed to a deepening rift between the protective instincts of a mother determined to shield her child and the rigid machinery of an institution more concerned with protocol than emotional welfare. And within this tension, Meghan's actions, once interpreted as defiance, began to be understood as strategic, as desperate measures to ensure that Lilibet's safety, her dignity, and her right to care and attention were not subordinated to the optics of royal tradition, a tradition that had, over decades, repeatedly prioritized image over individual well-being, and as this narrative unfolded, a pattern emerged, one that traced the invisible lines of intervention, the unseen hand of palace officials who sought to control not just information but behavior, the subtle nudges, the silent rules, the unspoken threats that dictated how conversations were held, who had access, and what knowledge was permitted to circulate. And within this environment, Meghan's insistence on independent action, arranging private consultations with pediatric specialists, advocating for alternative educational plans, ensuring that Lilibet's mental and emotional health was attended to by professionals outside of the established network, was not mere preference but a calculated, urgent response to systemic inadequacy, and as these measures became known, they illuminated a broader tension, instructing that the folder be sealed indefinitely and restricted to a select few within the royal legal apparatus, a move that suggested deliberate suppression rather than mere privacy, an action calculated to erase knowledge of what could potentially destabilize the carefully maintained narrative, leaving Meghan devastated, knowing that she had not only been kept in the dark but that there had been an active effort to obliterate the light of truth she sought for her daughter. And as she dug deeper, the realization crystallized. Whatever was in that file was not simply embarrassing to the monarchy, it was dangerous, and Harry, witnessing the deliberate concealment of information about his own child, was incensed, accusing the palace of treating Lilibet as a liability, a secret to be contained rather than a child to be protected. Yet with every further inquiry, the hole only deepened, staff fell silent, digital records disappeared, and the trail went cold, forcing Meghan to confront a devastating truth. If she could not access the file, if every conventional path was blocked, then she would have no choice but to expose the silence surrounding it, to break the barriers that had been erected against transparency. And with every door closed and every answer buried deeper, she turned to the one instrument the palace could not control. Her own voice, her own authority as a mother, her own moral imperative to protect her child. And in a move unprecedented for a former royal, she bypassed the official channels, the aides, the bureaucratic safeguards, and wrote directly to King Charles, a handwritten letter, personal, precise, a blend of pleading and reasoning, asking not for pity, not for diplomacy, but for the fundamental truth, for access to the records regarding Lilibet's medical history, a history the palace had quietly and deliberately locked away, emphasizing that this was not about titles, optics, or legacy, but about her daughter's future. And the reply she received was not familial but institutional, clinical, and detached, delivered through formal royal channels, acknowledging neither the emotional urgency nor the parental concern, and one line in particular shattered the fragile hope that remained. "This matter is no longer within your purview," a dismissal that signaled not just rejection but an absolute refusal to engage, a cold, unequivocal assertion that she had overstepped and that the monarchy had no intention of letting her back in. And the impact of this bureaucratic cruelty was immediate and profound, carving into her resolve even as it steeled her determination, and when she shared the letter with a trusted friend, it was not for comfort but for confirmation, validation of the institutional roadblocks she had faced, and within days, a snippet of the correspondence found its way into the tabloids, unattributed but unmistakable in tone, formal, detached, and revealing for the first time to the public the full extent of the barriers Meghan had confronted, and she did not deny the leak. Rather, she leaned into it, telling confidants that if the palace would not protect her child, she would take responsibility herself, and this was the moment the polite silence ended, the time for restraint over, the stakes too personal, too painful, too perilous, and Meghan had reached the point where she could no longer wait, could no longer hope that procedure, hierarchy, or tradition would safeguard Lilibet's well-being, and so she acted on her own terms, creating a broadcast that shook the foundations of royal authority, raw and unfiltered, recorded from a hidden location, eyes swollen, voice trembling yet resolute, revealing not just the reality of her daughter's serious, unnamed condition but also the systemic failures, neglect, and concealment that had enabled harm, the broadcast dropping without promotion or fanfare. Less than 8 minutes long, yet each second charged with the weight of a mother's desperation.